Did you know that in history there are cases when technological progress, paradoxically, has become the cause of the greatest human tragedies? At the beginning of the 20th century, the era of great geographical discoveries was coming to an end, and there were hardly any blank spots left on the map. People whose insatiable energy, thirst for personal glory, and desire to glorify their homeland with their discoveries or achievements turned their attention to the South Pole, Antarctica, which was still terra incognita at the time, allowing humanity to slightly unveil the veil of its immense white, majestic tent. Among such people were the Norwegian Roald Amundsen and the British Robert Scott. It was the year 1911, and Scott and Amundsen were preparing to conquer the pole simultaneously. Their preparations for the journey amid the deadly silence of the icy wasteland were hastened by what they knew about each other. Each of them had decided for themselves that they would be the first. To understand what led some to triumph and others to tragedy, we need to carefully examine what, how, and with what these brave, desperate people were planning to lead their teams to the coveted point on the world map. The Norwegians ordered clothing from the Eskimos made of seal skin, wolf fur, and reindeer. Each stitch of the clothing, every thread from a seal tendon, was dictated by the accumulated experience of generations of people living in the harshest climates. They chose glasses without lenses, wooden, with a bone frame and a thin slit for the eyes. Amundsen, in planning the expedition, asserted, "We need as few people as possible and as many dogs as possible." The sled dogs were the best that could be bought for quite a sum of money. People on his expedition were physically fit and skilled skiers. The food they took with them consisted of pemmican, dried meat with fat, nutritious but virtually carbohydrate-free. But Amundsen ordered pemmican from the Norwegian Army Depot with peas and oats, which was much better absorbed and contained many vitamins. There were also dry biscuits and a large quantity of chocolate, unlike the kind we buy today in supermarkets, powdered milk, products high in carbohydrates that provide strength and energy to the human body. Even for seemingly mundane items like biscuits, the wise Norwegian took great care. They were made from unsifted flour, oat flour, and yeast. The aforementioned was simply a treasure trove of vitamins B and C, which, as we will see, proved critically important during the arduous journey. The British, on the other hand, chose clothing made from factory wool, with a rubberized layer designed to protect against moisture. Scott did not bother to teach his companions skiing, inexplicably believing in his own luck and in the technological progress, the fruits of which, he probably thought, he would fully utilize. Sunglasses were selected that were more suitable for fashionable European ski resorts, round with tinted lenses. Food supplies also consisted of pemmican, but the ordinary kind, high in proteins and fats, biscuits, but ordinary ones made from white wheat flour and baking soda, practically devoid of vitamins. Just like breakfast in the homes of Old England, there was also cocoa, butter, and sugar, but clearly, as it turned out, not in sufficient quantities. As a mockery of fate, on one of the expedition's flags, the English had the fatal, as it turned out, motto, "We'll do without dogs." And indeed, there were few dogs purchased. There were snowmobiles, far from the most advanced and reliable mode of transport of the time, and ponies, or rather short-statured Manchurian horses, sturdy and enduring, And so, the first race to the pole in history began. The Norwegians, descendants of the fearless Norsemen, the Vikings, set out earlier. Their base camp was 100 kilometers closer. They marched quickly, and having reached the coveted goal, leaving behind a pitched tent and a flagpole with the Norwegian flag, they returned whole and unharmed. The organization of the expedition members' diet is noteworthy. The sled dogs, expertly handled by experienced Norwegians, carried a supply of food, mostly biscuits, on the sleds, and they themselves, the dogs, forgive us today's animal rights activists for such a thing, were a constant source of fresh meat, and therefore vitamin C, their meat was fed to the remaining dogs. But let's leave the returning Norwegians to bask in the rays of well-deserved glory and tell the story of the unfortunate Englishman whose journey to the pole, especially the return journey, was fraught with the most severe trials of body and soul and, ultimately, death. And so, 5 brave Britons, among whom there were no professional polar explorers like Amundsen had, except for Scott. But there were a zoologist, a naval officer, a sailor, and a cavalry officer, began their journey to the desired point on the map. A journey of 1,300 kilometers, through the icy desert and mountains. There turned out to be only 4 pairs of skis, and Lawrence Oates, the cavalryman, went on foot. The snowmobiles did not help the expedition. The harsh weather quickly rendered the imperfect mechanisms inoperable. The problem with the horses became apparent immediately. They endured the merciless Antarctic frost poorly, and during overnight stays, the immensely tired men were forced to build shelters for them out of snow as their hooves sank into the loose snow. And as for the dogs, Scott did not take them on the decisive dash to the pole. Because of this, the men were forced to carry the burden of tools and food themselves. The previously calculated amount of calories, 4,500 per person, was catastrophically insufficient, and the men grew thinner and weaker before their eyes. Each expedition along the way set up depots with supplies and kerosene to use on the return journey, but Scott believed that a flag above the tent would be enough to find it, while Amundsen ordered the entire route to be marked with flags. Result: the Englishmen wasted their dwindling strength searching for the depot, sometimes for many hours. The chain of miscalculations and unforeseen circumstances multiplied. For example, the British cans with kerosene on the return journey turned out to be half empty. The lead soldier did not withstand the low temperatures of the unusually severe. Even by Antarctic standards, weather and the fuel evaporated through the cracks. But the Norwegians did not have such problems. The experienced Scott, for some reason, made numerous mistakes in planning, but it is worth noting 2 fatal ones. When planning the campaign, for some reason, the Englishmen did not take into account the possible deterioration of the weather, repeating, "We cannot afford delay," and the provisions were taken back to back. No food reserves were made. He may have regretted it while waiting out the 3-day storm, but we will never know. When the detachment was moving towards the pole, carrying an unbearable load, Scott took pity on the tired people and allowed them to build a warehouse called 1 Ton, not at the 80th parallel as originally planned, and it turned out to be a couple of tens of kilometers further if you move from the pole to base. Fate turned out to be merciless. People did not reach this warehouse, which would have saved them 18 kilometers away. But all this inhuman suffering of the British was in vain. Having reached the South Pole, they saw Amundsen's tent and the Norwegian flag nearby. Terrible disappointment gripped the mortally tired people of the British expedition. The return journey has begun. The details of the death of the expedition make one shudder with horror. Edgar Evans died first. His weakened legs could not hold him on the ice slide, and when he fell, he terribly broke his head. He died a day later, remembering in his delirium about his mother's garden. The second victim was Lawrence Oates. When he realized that he could no longer walk and did not want to delay the others, he said, "I'll walk a little and won't be back soon." I walked out of the tent into the whiteout, leaving my shoes inside, staggering and falling, no longer feeling the blows of icy, rock-hard crumbs thrown into the face by a hurricane wind. The 3 survivors walked as long as they could. Bowers and Wilson were the first to die. Scott covered his comrades with blankets and wrote one last entry in his diary. "For God's sake, take care of our loved ones." When he was found, his numb fingers continued to clutch his pen and leather-bound diary. Nature has not forgiven man for neglecting himself and the false realization that he is its winner. But proud Britain refuses to admit it has lost the deadly race to the South Pole. The words of a British newspaper on this matter: Scott came to the pole second. Amundsen is second to last.